Hi all, I'm Professor Tina Good, and I want to go ahead and wrap up our conversation on Genesis. We have been spending a lot of time talking about Jacob and Jacob's family, but I think it's important that we also give some time to Abraham and Sarah and the families in between Abraham and Jacob, as well as a little bit more discussion on the biblical Jacob. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and give us a paradigm through which I want us to begin talking about biblical characters using Abraham and Jacob as examples. Okay, so we have already talked in this class about looking at characters as either round or flat characters. In a previous video, I talked to you about round characters in traditional literature, often being the main characters, often being our protagonists or our main character, our lead character, if you will. And that character generally has a conflict that is vexing that character throughout the story. That character is normally complex. That means that the character can surprise us, that the character is neither all good or all bad, but has to react to complex situations and can therefore surprise us, is not always predictable. And that usually that character has some sort of climactic event where the character has to make a decision, and then the conclusion is directly related to that decision and the conflict that the character has struggled with. As a result, there is a significant change in that character. Whereas flat characters are usually our minor or silenced characters, not our main characters. They often provide context for our story, but may or may not have their own conflicts. And they often serve as some sort of stereotype or metaphor that highlights some sort of anxiety within the culture. What I want to suggest to you is that while that is commonly true in traditional literature of today, that may not always be the case with our biblical characters. And that is because the Bible was written for a different purpose. The Bible and its stories are considered to be a didactic text, right? What does that mean? It means that its purpose is to serve as a teaching text. That its stories are meant to teach us lessons, and in so doing, it preserves the values and traditions of the culture for the audience of that day, as well as for the instruction of posterity. Okay, and so our characters in the Bible are often written as models that are to instruct people of that same category on how they should act and what they should do and what should be their priorities, et cetera, et cetera. And so in order to figure out what that model is, what that example is, we have to discern the characteristics by looking carefully at how the character acts in the story. Some examples within the Bible are, say, a model of a good tribal leader or a bad tribal leader, a model of a good wife or a bad wife, a good king, a bad king, a convert, maybe a model of a convert, a model of a martyr. I imagine you all can think of who that's going to be. A model traitor, a model prophet, and then maybe even say, model concepts. So a model of faithfulness, right? A model of deceit, a model of perhaps even a scarlet woman. Okay, so when we think of models, of course, what we have to think of is, Abraham, right? Abraham is the great grandfather, right, of Israel. He's the one who sort of is the ancestor that gets it all started. And so we have to look at Abraham as sort of, is he our model, right, for a good leader, and in this case, a good tribal leader. So in order to do that, we would want to look at the characteristics that are given to us in the Bible, right? So if we look and we go like, well, Abraham, what does he do? Well, he follows God's instructions, especially when he is called on to move his people, right? God says, move from here to here, and Abraham does it, right? He doesn't really question it. He just goes ahead and moves his people. Often there's a reason for doing that, but he nevertheless follows God's instructions. And in fact, he has direct contact with God. God actually speaks to him, or comes to him in a vision, or comes to him in a dream, but he has pretty much direct contact with God. In fact, he even gets to entertain God, in his tent, right? God actually comes to him with two angels, and they speak to each other. He has to have a covenant with God, right? So God tells him, if you do as I say, then you will have, all of these tribes and nations and nations and nations that will follow you and your sons. Abraham is a military leader. If you'll recall, Lot gets kidnapped, and his lands are overtaken. And so Abraham amasses, a military, and they go in and rescue Lot. They win, and as a result are able to sort of make a deal with the king. And at that point, they don't amass wealth, but they do establish a relationship where the king will no longer try to attack Abraham or Lot's people. Abraham is loyal to his family. He's loyal to Sarah. He's loyal to his brother. He's loyal to Lot. I think it could be argued that he is not loyal to his first son, Ishmael. He's certainly not at all loyal to Hagar, but he is loyal in other ways. Perhaps not completely loyal, but overall loyal, except for maybe to his firstborn son. He marries within the tribe, right? And he takes a beautiful wife. He, interestingly enough, lies about his wife, right? He lies about Sarah. He says Sarah is not his wife because he is afraid that he will be killed because of Sarah's beauty. So he tells Sarah, when he goes into a couple of different lands, he says, tell them you're my sister so that they won't kill me. And so she does, which is interesting, right? So he's kind of using Sarah, right, to protect him. Well, we've seen evidence of him being a military leader. Nevertheless, he is afraid to be killed. And so he lies about his wife. In one story, actually, it's suggested that Sarah became a part of the harem. And in the second story, the king does not actually sleep with Sarah. He tests God, right? He says to God, he's like, God, you said that I would have a son, and you haven't given me a son. And so all of my land, all of my wealth is going to go to a slave in my households. And because you haven't given me a son, instead of like accepting that God has said you will have sons and you will have all these nations that follow you, he sort of tests God about that, right? And if you would give me a son, then I will do this for you and whatnot. Significantly, though, he negotiates with God. And this happens particularly when God and the angels come to his tent, and they are there to go and destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham, for some reason, says, God, listen, what if there are 50, good people? Do you want to be the kind of God that destroys 50 good people Is that the kind of God that you want to be? Do you want people to think of you as that kind of God? And God says, all right, if there's 50 good people, I won't destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham says, what if there's 45? What if there's 40? And he keeps getting God down to finally they get to like 10. What if there's 10 good people? God's like, all right, if there's 10 good people, I won't destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, right? This is pretty gutsy of Abraham to do this, right? He's sort of testing God, challenging God, kind of playing on God's ego, if you will. Like, really, do you really want people to think of you this way? And I was like, okay. Of course, when it comes to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, there's no tally. They're not going around going, okay, there's only 8 people, right? Sodom and Gomorrah gets destroyed without that counting that takes place. So that moment where Abraham is negotiating with God is really pretty interesting. Abraham has concubines, right? Namely, he has Hagar, who is provided to him by Sarah. And Hagar then goes in at Sarah's request. Abraham sleeps with her, and they are provided with a son, Ishmael, who by all rights would have been Sarah's legal son, if not biological son. He then has another son with Sarah, so he has sons, which is very important in this time to have sons to continue on the family line. As we said before, he sells Sarah to these kings, and as a result, he's able to amass a great deal of wealth. He's also renamed by God. You remember, he's at first called Abram, and then once his covenant is in place, he becomes Abraham. And so we have to ask the question: is Abraham a flat character or a round character? Well, of course, we have to look at the story, and we see all of these things happening, and where he's negotiating with God, and he's having conversations with God, and whatnot, and he finally gets the thing that he wants, and that is his son with Sarah, Isaac. And then something happens with Abraham, and God tests, he says in the Bible, tests Abraham. He's like, take your son and sacrifice your son to me. Now, here is a man who has, negotiated with God over the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, who has conferred with Sarah, who has given Sarah a great deal of power within the tribe. And yet, when God says, sacrifice your son, he does not negotiate. He does not try to talk God out of it. He does not confer with Sarah. In fact, Sarah is completely silent at this moment. And he sort of lies to Isaac, or at least withholds the truth from him, and is willing to go and sacrifice his son, has his son completely bound up and ready. The knife is high when at the last minute, Isaac is saved. So what does this tell us about Abraham, right? I mean, certainly we have to agree that in the beginning, he's a very complex character, right? He has, conversations with God. He makes interesting decisions about his wife. But by the end, he seems to not have any complexity at all, right? He seems to have really lost his voice. Sarah is completely eradicated from the story. And so we have to ask, what is he a model of? Is he a flat character? Is he a round character? What does the character of Abraham meant to teach us? And then we go down a couple of generations, and obviously Isaac comes between Abraham and Jacob, but Isaac is really not all that significant, right? Essentially, he gives birth through Rebecca, for Esau and Jacob. He does have that same kind of cycle that Abraham does, where he sort of sells Rebecca in order to protect him But really, there's not a lot of development of Isaac's character other than he becomes blind and he becomes easily fooled by Rebecca and Jacob. So that's about it about from Isaac. I mean, certainly he's a character worth exploring, but I want to go ahead and jump to Jacob because I think he's more of a model of our tribal leader. And let's compare him to Abraham, right? So if we look at Jacob, right, he does move his people, but not out of necessity, but more out of necessity than God's command, right? He has to move his people to get away from Laban, so his sons can have a land of their own. Laban is taking advantage of them, and so it's convenient that God does now. Okay, it's okay to move your people, but really he does it more out of necessity. And then later on, we see him continually moving his tribes more out of necessity, whether it's famine, whether it's a need for pasture, for wells, whatever the case may be. He does have direct contact with God, more so through dreams and visions than through one-on-one conversation as Abraham had. So we are seeing God get a little bit more distant, but he does have direct contact with him. And he does have a covenant with God, the same as with Abraham, and that is that, that he will have nations and nations, that will be a part of his bloodline. Jacob is not a military leader. He does not go in and rescue anyone. Instead, really, he's somebody who more kind of runs away, right? When he tricks Esau and he's afraid of Esau, he runs away. And when Laban is taking advantage of him, he runs away from Laban. And in fact, the big war, if you will, the big battle in Shechem is actually done by his sons, not Jacob himself. Jacob is not really loyal to his family at all. He betrays Isaac and Esau, and he is also not loyal to Laban. He does marry within the tribe. He takes, again, a beautiful wife, just as Sarah was, but he also has two wives, right? He has not just one wife, but two wives. Leah and Rachel, who one could argue if we combine the two of them, they might be, equivalent of Sarah. He lies. Jacob lies, but not about his wife in order to protect him. Instead, he lies to gain his brother's inheritance. And he also tricks Laban, right, in order to get more of his flock, so that when he leaves a wealthy man. He does negotiate with God. There's a moment where he says, God, if you will do this, I will do this, right? That's pretty gutsy, right? Anyone to do. God, you do this, I'll do this, kind of making a deal with God. But interestingly enough, Jacob wrestles with God. He wrestles with God and he wins, right? Yes, he gets struck in the hip, but he actually wins his wrestling match with God. So this is very significant, right, when we think about Jacob's power. Jacob has concubines, as we know, Bilhah and Zilpah, and through all four women, he has many sons, which of course become the tribes of Israel. He does amass a great deal of wealth, but his wealth is mostly amassed through hard work, not through the selling of his wives and tricking other kings, although he does trick Laban. God does rename him. He becomes Israel. And so, we have to ask also now, is Jacob a flat or round character? He certainly does seem to be complex, especially, with regard to his treatment of Esau. But on the other hand, he just seems to be doing what his mother tells him to do. And he just does it. He doesn't really, feel bad about it. So I wonder just how complex Jacob is, right? He seems to be very self-interested, very self-motivated. And that does seem to drive who he is. But perhaps you think differently. Perhaps then Jacob is more the model of the tribal leader, given that he sort of does lack conflict. He does kind of lack change. And he does wrestle with God and win. So there is a suggestion maybe he's more of the model tribal leader than Abraham. And he is, after all, named Israel. So, how does the model of a tribal leader change from Abraham to Jacob, right? I mean, certainly Jacob tribe becomes much more infamous, right? It gives birth to 12 tribes. But we also have to ask, like, does each character have a conflict that comes to a climax? You can decide that, right? Maybe you might say Jacob's conflict comes to a point when he tricks Esau and he runs away. Maybe as when his sons attack Shechem. Maybe when he leaves Laban, right? And he has to make a decision. But do these things cause a fundamental change in his character? Does either character become more or less complex? Now, I want to get specific. Those are just general things that we would ask, but these particular guys, how do the characters' relationships with God compare? How about with their families? How about with their communities? Would you say that either are good tribal leaders or bad tribal leaders? And in so saying that, what would be the characteristics of a good tribal leader? And that's what I really want us to focus on as we move forward, right? And we identify these characters as being a model, right? Okay, so here's what they are. So now in looking at this, what makes a good tribal leader? And then also looking at, like, okay, so then if they are a model and are protagonist, right, do they change? And if they don't change, if they have a lack of change, right, what does this suggest about the lessons being taught to us, right, in these particular stories? Now, the theme of the class, you guys, is the Scarlet Women of the Bible. And we've been talking a lot about, Leah and Rachel and Bilhah and Zilpah. But I do think it's important that we take a look back also at Sarah, Rebecca, and Lot's wife and Lot's daughters. So quickly, let's just wrap that up. And you see here, I've done a very similar list that we did with Abraham and compared Sarah to Abraham, or maybe Sarah to Jacob. You decide, right? But we see there's a lot in common, right? Sarah doesn't follow God's instructions. In fact, she lies to God and laughs at God, right? When God says, you'll have a child, she's going to have a child. Sarah's like, that's ridiculous. And she laughs. And then God says, why did you laugh? I didn't laugh, right? So kind of, again, very sort of gutsy, like Abraham was when it came to having conversations with God. She does have indirect contact with God. She may not speak directly to God, although she does lie to God directly. But most of her contact is through Abraham. She does have an indirect covenant with God, in that God has said that Abraham and Sarah, right, that the generations that will follow will come from the child produced by Abraham and Sarah. She's clearly not a military leader, but she is loyal to her family, especially Abraham and Isaac, if not Ishmael and Hagar. She does marry within the tribe. She is beautiful. She allows herself to be sold in order to protect her husband. So we began to see this protection theme, particularly for mothers and wives. She does not test or negotiate with God, as did Abraham, but she does provide a concubine for her husband. So that shows a lack of faith in God, that God has said, listen, you will have a child. And she's like, I'm not going to have a child. It's not possible. So here, sleep with Hagar. She is responsible, as we said before, for Abraham's ability to amass wealth because she allows herself to be sold into the harem. God does rename her. I think she's one of the only women that does get renamed, just as Abraham and Jacob does. So that's pretty significant. And so we have to ask, is Sarah a flat character or a round character? It's really hard to know because we don't really see the end of Sarah's story per se, right? we commented before on how, when Abraham is going to go sacrifice Isaac, that Sarah is nowhere to be found, and that we don't really see Sarah again until her death. So is she the model of a good wife? If so, what does it mean to be a good wife? Is she the model of a good mother? If so, what does it mean to be a good mother? Is it contradictory to be a good wife and a good mother? And is she a scarlet woman? Remember, she did allow herself to be sold, right? Given away to the harem, possibly sleeping with one of the kings in order to protect her husband, right? Does this make her scarlet, right? What does it mean to be a scarlet woman? Rebecca, of course, very, very similar to Sarah, but she's a little bit more conniving, right? She deceives her husband in order to protect and take away the rights of her oldest son and give them to her youngest son, right? She is the grandmother of Israel, but is she a scarlet woman? She also allows herself to be sold in order to protect her husband, right? So comparing Rebecca to Sarah, right? Is Rebecca a model of a good wife, a model of a good mother? Is she a scarlet woman? And then finally, we have to touch on Lot's wife and daughters when we don't know a lot about them. But Lot's wife really should be the equivalent of Sarah. Remember, they split up the tribes. Abraham's went one way, Lot's went the other. So Lot's wife really should be the equivalent to Sarah. And yet we don't know very much about Lot's wife at all, only that she disobeys God and looks back as Sodom and Gomorrah are blowing up behind her. And consequently is turned into a pillar of salt, right? There is no mention of her trying to save her daughter, but I mean, it didn't happen. It's just obvious silence in the story when Lot tries to give his daughters away to the men in order for them to have sex with the daughters rather than the angels under his roof. So we have to ask the question, right? Is her punishment of being turned into salt, right, for disobeying God, is that justifiable when Abraham over here is negotiating with God, when Sarah's laughing at God and lying to God, right? And Lot's wife simply turns around when her home is being blown up behind her. And she's immediately turned into a pillar of salt, right? Is that justifiable, right? And what does this suggest about the character of God? Is Lot's wife a scarlet woman? Lot's daughters, of course, are problematic, right? Because after Sodom and Gomorrah are blown up, and all that's left of Lot's family is that they know of is Lot and the two daughters, right? They decide that they're going to get their father so drunk that he won't know that he's sleeping with them. And so that they can perpetuate the family line. First of all, is this believable, guys? Listen, is it possible that they could get their father so drunk 2 nights in a row that he doesn't know that he's sleeping with his daughters, right? And it would, if he was that drunk, would it even be possible for him to have sex with his daughters and have children? And why is it important that it's Lot's daughters that do this and not Lot himself, right? So why is the story even in there? What are we to learn from the story of Lot and his daughters, right? So Lot's wife and daughters are clearly flat. We just don't know enough about them. So what are they models of? What are we to learn from them? And would you say that Lot's wife and daughters are scarlet women? And so by now, we've gotten through the women of Genesis, And now we should be able to start putting together a profile, if you will, of what a Scarlet woman is, at least in, right, the first 5 books of Genesis. And this is important that we begin to put this profile together as we move into Judges, when we start getting even more complex women characters to take a look at. Okay, so I hope that you have found this video useful, and I hope that you will start to ponder some of these questions as we move forward, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, where there are fewer women, but still interesting women to consider in any case. Have a good day.